today's topic, we are going to look at data for decision making. So preparing for next year using the data sets that you have available to you. We're going to discuss strategies and planning for next year around the use of team-initiated problem solving. Christy's going to talk about that. I'll speak a little bit about the district capacity assessment and how you can use that data to help support implementation for the 16-17 school year. Luke Anderson will talk about the use of fidelity data for next year. And then Celeste is going to close us off with outcome data. And how might you prepare using data sets for your planning for successful implementation and continued implementation for the next school year. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat feature located at the bottom of your webinar control board. And Carrie Fulton's joined us, and she'll be monitoring the chat as we go throughout the presentation. At the end of each person's section, you'll have a chance to ask a question. Otherwise, we'll take questions at the end as well. So without further ado, Christy.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm going to be talking about the team-initiated problem-solving model. And Mike, if you just go back one, just to see what the model looks like. The intro slide, if that's possible. Thanks, Mike. So the team-initiated problem-solving model, or another acronym that we use in education, TIPS, is now at TIP 2, and we really want to thank the researchers involved for close to a decade now with looking at a problem-solving model that teams can use to develop their student outcomes that they want to establish. And of course, the researchers we want to acknowledge come from the University of Oregon, Dr. Rob Horner and Ann Todd, as well as the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and that is Bob and Kate Algazine and Gail Cusmano and Angela Preston. So they've done some great work really bringing this information and refining it for us, like I said, close to 10 years now, to be able to present to us a very efficient and effective way for teams to use data. The definition that has been defined as what a team-initiated problem-solving model is was taken from the PBIS Leadership Forum this year at the roundtable discussion on TIPS. They operationally define TIPS as a problem-solving framework used during meetings, and it could be any meeting, a PBIS team meeting, an RTI meeting, or even your MTSS meeting, that focused on database decision-making to improve student outcomes. What's really important to know about TIPS, it's just not for behavior. Really being able to use varied data sources is important. And if you could see inside the circle where it says collect and use data, that could be academic data as well, like DIBELS or AIMS, or your Swiss behavioral data. But also content area can be used in this problem-solving model, like academics, behavior, social, emotional competency, and levels of application, school, district, state level, and it's really nice to see this model as we move into the data sources that we're going to talk about later on in this webinar. So with the research, there is an online site that you could go to. Does everybody see the www.tips2info.blogspot.com? You'll find resources there. For additional information regarding the research study that has come out, there's been 2 of them. You may want to go to pbis.org and find the roundtable dialogue. It's a brief about TIPS, and it'll talk more in detail about the research. But the research has supported that teams can be trained in using a problem-solving model. And what they found was those teams that use that model had better outcomes for students. So the more practice we have with problem solving, the more fluent we become and more efficient in really solving problems that we establish. You can see that the TIPS training is a 1 full day team training, followed with a 1 full day coaches training to support teams. And we all know about developing sustainability and capacity, so we want to be sure to be able to coach those coaches for their team meeting. The critical elements for tips is about being in a meeting and using those team meeting minutes to guide and prompt the decision-making process. We have in meetings formal roles and responsibilities that have been defined, and we also emphasize that when we're at a meeting, we project our team meeting minutes so that we're all on the same page and we understand what the data is telling us. To start looking at that 6-step problem-solving model. So we're going to go through the steps, the 6 steps right now, and see how we can use that in a team meeting. So if we click to the next one, Mike. Awesome. So here are the 6 steps. And if you just click them all so that everything shows up, Mike, we'll just do it all at once, okay? Perfect. So we're going to start at the top. And the top says that we really begin with identifying problems with precision. And that's understanding the WH questions, the what, the why, the how, the where. And we want to be able to then take that precise problem statement, which is really like a hypothesis. Data is telling us and giving us a clear picture of what might be going on. And the more precise we are, the better we will be in creating our solution plan. We want to be able to identify potential for change. So given the data, the qualitative data and quantitative data that we have, we want to define what level we want to establish for change. And we'll give you an example of that in just a few minutes. And once we have our goal established, that's when we develop our solution plan. So that's the 3rd step. And on our solution plan, we want to be able to use behavioral elements to make sure that we're creating a plan that will have behavioral change. We then want to implement the solution with high integrity. So we want to do things that will make the change, and we want to follow the fidelity, saying that we're going to do what we said we were going to do. And then we want to measure the outcome and compare that to the goal that we originally established. And finally, making some decisions about what to do next. So that's the 6-step process. So Mike, if you just keep on clicking, and it says you were disconnected, please check your internet connection. So you must be doing that, and I can't see anything. Is that right?
They can see the screen still.
Okay, and apparently I can't because I was disconnected. Okay, so are we on the page that has the team meeting minutes?
Yes.
Okay, thanks for following, and I'm just going to pretend like I know what I'm seeing right here on the screen, okay? So in the left corner of your team meeting minutes will be the first step of your 6-step problem-solving model, and that's identifying the problem with precision. And when we looked at our Swift data, and that's where we got this information, we looked at our core report, and we had a red flag as to what was going on at this particular school site. And what we found was the red flag showed a high incidence of harassment. So in our drill down, we asked the question, if harassment is our problem behavior, who has the most incidents for harassment? And we found out it was the 5th and 6th graders. And then we drilled down to find out that harassment was occurring with the 5th and 6th graders on the playground. And we drilled down to find out that it wasn't all of the time, it was between 2:45 and 3:30. And then finally, we wanted to find out the reason or motivation behind that, which is our function of behavior, and we have peer and adult attention. So does everybody see that on the decision statement? It answers the WH question, because I can't see a thing, and
yes.
I'm guessing it's there. Is that right?
You are in the right spot.
Okay. And at the bottom of that, it'll have current level. And so you want to start with your precision statement and the data that you've used, that data source, to say what's going on with our numbers, because that will guide in our goal that we're going to establish. So if you click on to the next one, which would be the identify goal for change, you'll see then that the minutes prompt us into the next step. We're not solving the solution right off the bat. We really need to define it with precision and then develop our goal. And we talk about SMART goals, being very specific, measurable, accurate, reasonable, I always say, and timely. And so for this particular team, they decided that they were taking the number of office discipline referrals that they had the month before and reducing it by 2. And then the following month, they were going to reduce it by 1. And they felt that that was very doable for them and reasonable. And then Mike, you want to click to the next one that shows the third step, which is identifying the solution and creating an implementation plan with contextual fit. And it's really looking at the elements based on behavioral science that we need in our plan. And listed there are, what we always start with is prevention. So what prevention strategies can we put in place that will address the precision problem statement? What can we teach? What can we acknowledge or reinforce? Those are the top three that we focus on, and we want to include whatever we do in a behavioral support plan or a school-wide solution plan. We also want to look at extinction and corrective consequences to be part of our plan if necessary. But we're not going to get into that right now because we're only going for like 2 more minutes, right, Mike?
That's correct.
So our plan will include those strategies and elements. And then if you click to the next one, Mike, we're going to implement that solution with high integrity. And you can see what that looks like. We want to check the fidelity to see we're doing what we said we were going to do. And we also then want to look at the outcome data to say, did we make the change that we wanted? And we move through the system of identifying fidelity and outcome data with identifying what we're going to collect, when we're going to do it, who's going to do that for both of them. And then I think, Mike, if you click to the next one, we're going to monitoring impact of solution and comparing against the goal. And we really ask the question, did it work? And then you can see in your team meeting minutes, it guides you into that next step. So where are we with our fidelity data, and at what level are we at? So maybe we only partially implemented it. Maybe the person didn't do what they said they were going to do. They did it a little differently, and we didn't see a change. So we would make notes on that. And looking at the outcome. So when we set our goal initially, we want to use that to compare where we are then with where we are now. So where are you? Did it get worse? There's no change or improved, but not to goal, or did the goals be met? And then you'll see that this is a circle within circles, which I love all the time because they're never ending. And that's when we make summative evaluation decisions. And we do that because we need to know what's next. So maybe we have solved this problem. Maybe we've reduced the incidences that we said we were going to do. But everything is contextual to your school site and what your team feels is important. I'm going to end there, Mike, because I think that's my time.
Okay. Thank you so much, Christy. Carrie, do we have any questions for Christy?
No.
Okay, well, we are going to roll into using the district capacity assessment for planning for 16-17 school year. And I want to first start off by thanking the researchers and really implementers and developers across the U.S., Dr. Rob Horner, University of Oregon, Dr. Dean Fixon at University of North Carolina, and Dr. Aaron Shapiro, who actually has a webinar available at our website if you'd like to see a full webinar on the district capacity assessment. More information on the district capacity assessment can be found at the State Implementation Center for Scaling Up of Evidence-Based Practices, or CISA. And at the bottom of the screen, you're able to see the connection, or if you just Googled CISA, you would be able to get there. So why use the DCA? The DCA provides us with an opportunity for a district to look at our capacity to implement, and provides a framework for planning to improve our district capacity. Someone told me recently the DCA affords them an opportunity to make sure that they're doing what they said they were going to do by implementing PBIS, and also to be able to use it for progress monitoring. It can be used at the state, regional, or local levels as well. District capacity assessment focuses on 9 key areas through 26 items or 26 questions. Leadership, action planning, performance feedback, selection of programs, what your training looks like, coaching, do you have coaching in place, and what's your capacity to sustain that, your capacity for decision making, is administration involved in your PBIS work? Are you supported by a district administration or school site administration? and then your systems for intervention. How do you select what you have, and what types of interventions do you have scaffold to your PBIS framework? What a question, this is an example of what a question would look like, and we're going to get into a sample of what you might see if you do a district capacity assessment for your planning for next year, where you see the DIT is the team, district implementation team has access to data for the evidence-based initiative. So you could be using this for PBIS. You could also use the DCA for other initiatives, maybe a language arts or a math initiative. Whichever initiatives you're implementing, the DCA will fit for that. In this case, we're going to look at PBIS. And team score, are we doing this? Is it in place? 2 points. 1 point for partially in place, and then if we're not using data, 0 points would be scored. If you're familiar with the tiered fidelity inventory or other tools on PBIS assessments, it's the same general point scale that used. Another question, is the build and implementation team have plans that are linked to the district improvement plan? I put that sample question here because I wanted to show that making that connection between the school site team and the district plan or the LCAP plan is one of the tools that you can use the DCA for. You can use it to help monitor the implementation of your initiatives that are contained in your local control accountability plan or your LCAP plan. Teams vote. So as you go through and your facilitator reads each of the questions, the majority would win. So if the team felt that this initiative was only partially in place, then we would have 1 point granted. And we usually do that with a thumbs up if it's in place, middle, or thumbs down if it's not in place. So, score in the DCA. I want to show you some samples of what your scores might look like. And we'll first look at a sample school where we're going to see the total score. So when you take the DCA in this sample school, you had a DCA score of about 50%. So they have capacity levels of around 50%. For a first-year school, this is pretty good, but it'll show you where you need to make improvements, and we'll see that in a moment. The sub-skills scores, you can see here, they're doing really well in performance assessments. Selection is a little bit low. Administration and systems interventions are a little bit low. The other categories are approaching 80%, and our goal really is to get at 80%. So if we were to use the sub-skill, as you'll see in a moment, this is an opportunity to craft out an action plan for next year. You can rate the sub-score over the course of several years. So you'll see here, it was done once in October of 2013, and then again in 2014. So you can rate the change, and when you're able to test against 3 years, so we could actually add another year to this and see a 3-year total, so districts can see what's our rate of improvement, what areas do we need to work on, and where have we improved at. These types of graphs are really good if you're presenting to your board or your cabinet level administrators to tell the story about how you're implementing PBIS. So let's look at the items. We can drill this assessment down even further to specific items. You can see item 1 in this sample rated 2 points, so it's in place. There's a district implementation team to support the implementation of the effective innovation, or in this case PBIS. And I think 17 will then show you that partially in place. The school teams are developed, function, and supports for the evidence-based initiative. And this gives the team an opportunity as you plan for next year to begin to really drill down what were those specific areas we needed to work on. And then we divide those 9 categories into drivers. And you have leadership drivers, competency drivers, and organizational drivers, and then a total assessment score at the bottom. And this is the last query you can run in the district capacity assessment and on the website at SISUP. It really gives a team a good overview of what area do we need improvement in. In this sample, the school's doing pretty good. We're at 80, 70%, 100% in training. Facilitative administration would be an area for this school that I would concentrate on. It's around 50%, with decision making at 67%. And that tells me they might not be planning for next year using data or using something like the TIPS model as a data tool for decision making. So how do we action plan for next year? So the DCA provides you with an action planning tool. And we want to look at those graphs I showed you previously and the 9 key areas, the sub-skills to develop our action plan. And we want to call attention to what's the action we're going to take, who's going to do it, when is it going to be done by, and then are we going to update it. So if you've been doing PBIS for a while, you'll be real familiar with our strategies for ensuring that things get done, and this is very similar to the TIPS model. So on this sub-skill, we're going to look at selection as an area where this district could improve, and a strategy we might take or an action we might take would be utilization of the hexagon tool. If you're not familiar with the hexagon tool, it can be found at the AI Hub, but it's a mechanism for selecting a practice. And once you put that in place, the plan was that Mike would do that by August 1st of next school year, and then we're going to update the team in February. The next area that this team would want to look at would be coaching. Coaching is just over 20%, and we want to focus on that for the next school year by identifying and select a PBIS school or PBIS coach for a specific school. So you might have several schools that rated themselves, but in this sample, Elm Street may not have had a coach for implementation of PBIS. So our focus for Elm Street would be on giving them a coach or getting a district level coach connected with Elm Street. Carrie will work on that. It will be done by August. And then again, we're going to update when we do the DCA again in February. And then the final sample area that the school is going to focus on is decision support systems. And in this case, we're going to look at implementing the TIPS model for the district site level. Christy gave you a great example of that for decision making. Phil, the administrator, is going to implement TIPS or put TIPS into motion, and that will also be done at the beginning of the next school year and evaluated a little sooner by October. So we want to make sure that the teams are using the TIPS model for decision making. Whenever we're planning by using the district capacity assessment, I always ask that schools pick a couple things that you know you can accomplish very quickly and easily, and then some items that might take a little longer. And in this case, selection and coaching might take a little bit longer to build that capacity up to 80%, but for decision making, I think we can achieve 80% fairly quickly. And I will turn it over now to Luke Anderson, who's going to talk about fidelity data.
All right, thanks, Mike. So I'm going to talk a little bit about fidelity data and PBIS. This is the kind of data we use to answer the question, are we doing what we said we would do, and are we implementing practices as they were intended? So a couple of objectives in this section. I'm just going to describe briefly the why of fidelity data. Why do we take fidelity data? Talk a little bit about how school sites use the TFI, how a school district may use the TFI, the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, and then also just talk a little bit too about how fidelity data can just be used to support professional development plans. So we're all familiar with the circle graphic in PBIS. We have our outcomes, which are social competence and academic achievement. And we use data to support all decisions, to support the practices which support student behavior. So those practices touch students directly. And then the systems that support the adult behavior in delivering those practices. One thing we know, though, is that there's pretty clear evidence that the more clearly the core components of an intervention program are known, the more readily it can be implemented. So we got a little bit of research that's supporting this idea of having real clear definitions of what are these practices that we should be doing. Going a little deeper into some of the implementation science, so we do know that intervention is one set of activities, and it used to be that we would stop there. We had an evidence-based practice. We could produce effects out in the field, oftentimes paying people a little bit of money to help them implement, offering gift cards and things. But then when we got to the actual real world, the implementation, if you will, things weren't always going as smoothly. So implementation is a very different set of activities, and there are particular things that we want to do to support schools in implementing those evidence-based interventions. So we kind of need to hold those concepts simultaneously. We have to hold them both in our head. It's not enough to know what to do. We need to make sure that it actually happens. So, what helps with implementation? Number one, having a system in place to monitor implementation. So, by monitoring implementation, we're actually going to help ensure that implementation is done accurately. Another piece is access to technical assistance. This is where the folks out there in the CPC can provide some help. So by having somebody providing assistance alongside you and actually implementing the interventions. And we need to manage risk along the way. And also it's important that the folks that are implementing have a belief in the evidence base. So when we're talking about those great PBIS studies out there, being able to articulate those clearly and have folks do the research on their own. So that's what's helpful. And then it's also worth noting that on the flip side, when we look at things that aren't helpful, things that are harmful for implementation, the extent to which a program is modified from the way it was originally researched is negatively related to how well it's implemented, which kind of makes sense, right? So when we're talking about fidelity and PBIS, lots and lots and lots of different measures out there. It is nice that there is the tiered fidelity inventory, which does have the capability of monitoring tiers 1, 2, and 3. And it's a little bit flexible. It can be completed with a coach or without a coach, and there's also a walkthrough tool that can be utilized, although it does not need to be utilized. Having sat through the administration of the TFI, I do think that coaching piece is helpful. For whatever reason, some schools will tend to score themselves maybe overly negatively, if you will, and some schools may view their implementation with rose-colored glasses. We also have tools like the SET, which is more of a walkthrough tool that was designed to assist in research, very similar to the TFI walkthrough tool. And then Christy mentioned earlier, or presented earlier on tips, and there are specific implementation fidelity checks for specific parts within PBIS, such as tips. That's a very helpful tool. One of the things we know is that tips is a little bit complex, and it's a bit much for schools to go back and do without some coaching, and that tips fidelity tool is a great tool to use for that coaching process. And we also see some classroom-specific self-assessments. There's the classroom management self-assessment by George Sagai and some others. And there's another one in a book by Wendy Reinke the Motivational Interviewing for Effective Classroom Management, which is a really neat book and process, if you will, for supporting folks in implementing those PBIS type practices in the classroom. So back to our TFI. Fast, efficient, all in one spot. So it's broken down. There's a feature, there'll be data sources, and then scoring criteria. And these data all go into PBIS assessments, and you'll see in a second here it's going to produce graphs that are essentially identical to the DCA graphs that Mike was showing, and that they're housed on a similar platform. So here's one example of a school that took the tiered fidelity inventory. You can see they've taken it 3 times. They took it the first time in February of 2015, took it again in October of 2015, and then again in January of 2016. You can see each time they took it, they took the Tier 1 components, or section, if you will, of the TFI, and then the last 2 times they did the Tier 2 as well. And nice to see they're improving each time. And it gives them a little bit more data in terms of teams, implementation, and evaluation. So are their teams solid? Are they set? Are they implementing the core features? And then do they have a nice solid evaluation system? So back to the TFI, a specific example. So from this school, teaching expectations, they told their team, they all agreed that they were a 1. They weren't quite a 2 yet because they had not developed a formal system of teaching the behavior expectations. They did have some lesson plans. They didn't really have a written out process for the when these lessons will be taught. And they also had not done the walkthrough, so they weren't really sure how many students actually knew the behavior lessons. So here's their, within the PBIS assessments, you can get a printout that will tell them the item scores for each administration. So you can see the last 2 here. And they had scored a 1 in this area the last 2 times, and they had identified this as an area to improve on. On their action plan, 1.4, current score is a 1. Remember, they did have some of the written pieces, but they didn't really have a written plan for implementing. So what I want you to do is just think for a second, what would be a logical action item to address that 1.4? And in your head, you're probably screaming right now, develop a plan to teach those behavior lessons. And so that is what this school decided to do, and they assigned Mike. And Mike's going to get it done by 1/1/17. Poor Mike's probably going to have to do it at midnight because he's so busy. Sorry. All right. So that's at the school level. At the school district level, these items can also be examined. So here's a particular school district. They had 19 schools take the tiered fidelity inventory, and they downloaded their results and just looked at them by item in Tier 1. So what items in the TFI were being implemented better than other ones? Where might they need a little bit of coaching and support, and where might they need to do a little bit of celebrating? So you can see the schools in this school district did have their behavior expectations defined. So they, generally speaking, were scoring really well on that item. They had those 3 to 5 behavior expectations. They were safe, respectful, responsible, or they were showing pride, or whatever you will. They also, upon looking at this, noted that family involvement was a little bit low. So this district decided that was an area that they needed to beef up a little bit in terms of professional development and coaching. They did a little bit of reflection and thought, are we really providing our schools with enough support in this area, or do they need a little bit more from us? So they used that to target their coaching for the next year. So if you think about this as a grade book, this might be looking at the grade book, looking down the column there, where it's each item is almost like a lesson. And if you're looking down the column and you see that students continue to struggle in one particular area, it may be that we need to change up the nature of instruction, if you will. The other way we tend to look at data might be going back to our grade book example as by student, but in this example we're going to look at by school. So these are the Tier 1 total scores from the TFI for this particular school district pretty early on in their PBIS implementation. And they could see you had a lot of schools above that 70% criterion. So a lot of schools implementing at that point where we'd say, you know, they're implementing Tier 1 with fidelity. And then they also had some that they needed a little bit more support. So again, being able to direct some resources in terms of coaching and support to those school sites to help beef them up and get them ready for Tier 2. One last thing I'll show you pretty quick here is an example of how a school used some surveys and fidelity assessments to drive some professional development. They used a classroom behavior self-assessment, did it in Google Docs, broken down by a few different criteria here. And this particular assessment asked the teachers to rate to what extent did they have a practice in place and what was their priority for improving in that practice. Because they were going to do a focus on some classroom practices for the first part of the school year. So what we're looking for here would be a low blue bar and a high red bar, because that would mean that it's not totally in place and it's a high priority. And you can see down there in F, responding to inappropriate behavior. That is our area. And then they were able to look a little bit deeper here as to what's going on at the particular items. And they identified that responding to inappropriate behavior was the area to target. So they had an area of strength. They were using their pride tickets, or sharp tickets in the classroom, but they also weren't documenting problem behavior occurrences appropriately. So the teachers worked in their grade level teams and identified their own improvement strategy for how they might address that. So in this case, they said they were going to ask the PBIS team member for a refresher on how to use the office referral form. And they were going to review the school-wide problem behavior definitions, and they had their start date, evaluation date set as well, and then resources that they might need to accomplish that. So that is the fidelity at the end of the year and PBIS quick overview. I'm going to hand it over to, there's some questions.
So it looks like the folks were interested in a few of your graphs there, Luke. There's a specific question about the TFI by item graph that you displayed, and they're wondering if you got that from PBIS eval, or is that a Luke Excel magic graph?
This graph I did make in Excel prior to the TFI being available in PBIS evaluation. I don't think that PBIS evaluation will give you a by item graph. I think you actually have to export it into Excel, if I remember correctly, but that would be something we'd want to check on.
You can download it as an Excel and then create a graph.
So the nice thing with PBIS eval, you can download all of your schools at one time, which makes it much easier, but it is going to give you all of their every time that they've taken the TFI through the years. So you have to go back through and clean up some of the old ones and make sure you have the most current one.
There's another question. The Sagai classroom practices self-assessment I am finding online looks a bit different than what was shown. As a comment.
This one that we showed here, let me click here. This one is actually an example where they took a couple of different self-assessments. So this one's based on the Sagai one, and then also some culture responsive classroom practices from, I believe it's Illinois, I'd have to look back, and then also the Wendy Renke one. So this particular school district combined several to best meet their needs. This was actually in San Juan where I used to work. And then what made it really nice was being able to upload that into a Google Doc and get those charts. Made it easier for decision making for the school teams.
Looks like they understand now.
All right.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand it over to Celeste for real this time.
Thank you, Christy, Luke, Mike. Excellent presentations, hard to follow all of them. And thanks to all of you for attending and for hanging in there with us this afternoon. This next section, using data for annual action planning, I'm going to begin the focus with outcome data, but then bring it into how we can provide evaluation reports and action planning for our schools, districts, and families. So the question we have is, what we are doing, is it making a difference for all students? What data do we use to answer that question? How do we develop an action plan? And how do we share the information with our staff, families, and districts? One thing that I want to say, this list of data that we can review, outcome data we can review, this is certainly not exhaustive, and each school district and school is going to focus on the particular data that is most critical and important to them, that they want to see changes and positive outcomes in. So a few of the examples here: office discipline referral data. I have the triangle data report and average referrals per day per month report that we can get in Swiss. Suspension and expulsion data. That's good data to review annually as well as throughout the year. Ethnicity data from Swiss. There are 3 reports. I included the referral risk index report, where we can look at what that looks like for the students at our school, and how does that look year to year. Is that an area that we need to focus on to action plan? And of course, academic data, looking at that, as well as attendance data. This is all very important data to review as we're creating action plans for the end of the year, beginning of the next school year. In the last PBIS Assessment Coordinator newsletter, there was an excellent article by Courtney, and I put Rao, and her name's Huck. She was married. And she shared on how we can coach schools to increase their evaluation scores on the TFI. And our team here, we were pretty excited about this, because we noticed that in our TFIs generally, that last question about the evaluation, teams were scoring really low. And it was a combination of things. First of all, understanding what the particular question meant, and then what type of report are we talking about. We did check in with Rob Horner about that, because some of our schools are thinking we had to do a huge report that takes lots of time. We don't have that much time in the spring to do that. And he said it's a summary to make sure that we're giving information to our school families, our school staff, and our district. So Courtney, in this article, she talks about how we can coach our schools to increase that evaluation data planning. And the steps she highlighted are having access to data systems with instant access, and use that data to make decisions. So whether it's behavior data, academic data, attendance data, when we have teams that can get access to that data quickly and efficiently, that helps make good decisions. We want to generate a graph comparing our TFI data or any other fidelity data that we're using throughout the year to show our improvement and growth. And then also, again, with our outcome data, behavioral, academic, attendance data, any other data that we identify, to have graphs and information that shows that as well. Another area that she shared is using the data. So once we have the data, it's not just enough to just pass it around, but use that data to identify the successes and then action plan on our areas needing improvement for the next year. We want to be sure to share that information with our staff in June and or August, professional development time, to let them see the growth from the previous year and also highlight what we want to work on for this next school year. And then another critical piece is sharing that information, a brief summary with our parents in the newsletter, at parent meetings, and also presenting at the district leadership team meetings, so that we have that information at least annually for everyone to look and give feedback. In the TFI, there are 3 basic evaluation questions, and they're at the end of the Tier 1 section, Tier 2, and Tier 3 sections. So in Tier 1, it says what is the effectiveness of our practices, and then it lists a whole lot of different possible data sources. And in order to get a school for a school to get a 2 on it, of course it says evaluation is conducted annually with outcomes, and it's shared with stakeholders with clear alterations in process based on evaluation. In other words, with clear changes in mind that we want for the next school year. So a summary, after we're bringing all this information together, we want to develop, and as we talked to Rob Horner about it, he said it could be a 1-page summary where we are providing a brief snapshot of where our school is this year. So in this example, and this is just one example, and this data, this particular school was using their TFI scores, their ODRs, and the reading benchmarks to give a brief sample of their Tier 1 implementation. And so you can see that they're about 70% of their TFI scored in the lower range on their team, 25% on the team. Office discipline referrals, you could see that they had a couple of months that were peaks for them. But they did see improvement also in their academics in the spring in their academic benchmarks for literacy. So from that, they created an action plan for the next school year. So solidifying their team, planning for reteaching, and continuing for professional development. So this information can be used by the team and the school in planning for the next year, but it's also great information for the school district, for school families to know, and this can meet the needs of all involved. In Tier 2, it's what the effectiveness and efficiency of our strategies for what we provide with our Tier 2 interventions. And so possible data sources, as you can see on the right, there are the TFI lists many, and we just want to be able to give information to our staff and district leadership on how our Tier 2 is being implemented, and then also are there some changes, action items that we want proposed on that evaluation. So here's an example of a Tier 2 summary. So they include their fidelity data from the TFI, and you can see that they've shown some quite a bit of growth in both Tier 1 and Tier 2. And then also they did a chart showing the effectiveness of their Tier 2 interventions. So this particular school, they have check-in, check-out, social skills groups, anger management, and homework club. And it shows the number of students and the number of students meeting the goal that were identified in those interventions. And then what's the success rate? So you can see that 3 of their 4 interventions are pretty successful. It looks like one is not as successful, and that's an area that they wanted to focus on with their action plan. So you can see over to the right, this particular school created an action plan is to increase the number of check-in, check-out students on check-in, check-out by adding another mentor. They're going to change the format of that anger management group, and I think I was the one that led one of those. I had an anger management group like that one time. And it's important to look at the data and be open to see what's not working and what can we change to improve for the next year. And then this school also wanted to consider adding a recess intervention, Recess Academy, for students needing that intervention for the next year. In Tier 3, the evaluation question talks about the extent to which Tier 3 supports are meeting the needs of students, families, school personnel. And again, there's possible data sources at the right. And I forgot to put the 2 in there of what would meet the 2, but again, it's clearly identifying the areas that we want to put in our action plan for the next year and sharing it with our staff and stakeholders. So here's an example of, it's the wrong, I'm sorry, it's the wrong example here. Our Tier 3, the one that I did have in there, I'm sorry, cut and pasted the wrong one on there, had this particular school is using Prevent, Teach, Reinforce. They were also using Wraparound, and so they were assessing the number of students involved in those, how many were meeting the goal, the percentage that was successful. They also were talking about their behavior support plans, IEPs, and behavioral goals, and how effective that was. And then, so in their action plan, they were focusing Specifically on their wraparound, it was very successful, but they only had 2 students in it for the year, and they were going to try to increase that for the next year. And their behavior support plans, they felt they needed to make some improvement in training on that. So I apologize that that report example isn't there. We did put together this example for Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, and we can definitely send that out if that's something that you're interested in, just looking at some brief annual school summaries that can be shared, or that you would develop that can help meet that TFI goal. So in review today, important for our schools and teams to have access to data systems with instant access so they can use that data, generate the graphs, comparing the fidelity and outcome data throughout the year, sharing that in the year, using that data to celebrate successes. Often we use data to highlight our areas of growth, but we want to celebrate the successes just as much. And sharing that information with staff. That communication with staff is just critical in keeping our staff involved, informed, and on board with PBIS implementation. Sharing that information with families and newsletters and with our district leadership team meetings is also very important. So we're at the end here. We're going to ask questions. Do want to thank everybody for coming today. Are there any questions, Carrie?
No, not anymore.
We did have one question come up as to whether the slides would be posted online, and we should get those posted up at pbis.ca.org within about a week or so. We're also going to try and post a recording of the webinar if you have team members who couldn't make it online as well for those folks who couldn't make it today. And any last minute questions, Gary?
I have one thing before I turn it back to Mike. Thank you to Mike and the team for acknowledging retirement. It's been awesome to work with the team here. And also, I just feel honored to work with all of you in California and really excited about all that you youngins are doing with PBIS here. I'll look forward to hearing wonderful words about all your work. So best to all of you.
Great. So thank you all so much for joining us today. That concludes this month's webinar for PBIS and the California PBIS Coalition, and we look forward to you joining us at the conference and look for further announcements throughout the year. Have a good evening.